Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We're excited that you're here. I'm going to start our introduction as people are coming in. Thank you for coming. My name is Shay Quarry, and I serve as the Programs Manager for the DC Preservation League. I'm joined today by Dr. Richard Walker from the Living New Deal Project and by my coworker, Zachary Burt, who is running the live stream. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are Washington, D.C.'s citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of the nation's capital. I have a few things to go over today before we get started. I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite free programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, QTAC Rock, Douglas Development Corporation, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Robert Benson Photography, Buyer Blender Bell, Building Innovation Hub, EHT Tracers Inc., KCE Structural Engineers, and Quinn Evans. Thank you all for your dedication to historic preservation in DC. Moving on, we have just a few notes on how today's webinar will run. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box that is found at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions, and we will go through those towards the end of the program. The chat will not be available during the presentation, but will be open when we move into the discussion period for the Q&A. For those of you who are joining us on Facebook, Zach will be monitoring any questions you might have, and he'll send those our way here on Zoom. And now that we've covered that, I'm so pleased to introduce you all to today's speaker. Dr. Richard Walker is Professor Emeritus of Geography at the University of California, Berkeley, where he taught from 1975 to 2012. He is co-author of The Capitalist Imperative, published in 1989, and The New Social in 1992. Extensively of the city, the Atlas of California, and pictures of a gone city. He also serves as treasurer on the Living New Deal nonprofit board of directors. I had the privilege to work with Richard, and I'm really excited about this talk. And so, Richard, I will hand it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Shay. It's always a pleasure. DC Preservation League does great work, and I'm very happy to talk about Washington, D.C. and art and architecture and public works. Now I'm going to share my screen so you can see that I have a PowerPoint, everyone. And okay, that should be working. We're good. Shay, tell me, when you were speaking, there was a little bit of delay. So tell me if that's happening to me. I'm not sure if I have a solution to it, but at least I'd know.
I can hear you. It might have just been my internet, but you're good.
Okay. All right. Hopefully mine is working. Okay. Well, great pleasure to be here. I want to talk today. Not exactly the same title as Shay gave me in the advertising. I want to call attention, first of all, to the fact that 2023 is the 90th anniversary of the launching of the New Deal, the inauguration of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933. And I'm going to talk about New Deal public works, art, and architecture. Oh, and I see I've come unplugged. Okay, maybe my voice will be... why have these silly earphones if I'm not plugged in? So I'm going to talk about public works, art, and architecture. And I'm going to start, as you'll see here, with the New Deal and the Living New Deal, and then talk about what the New Deal did in DC, in the district. I'm not going to be talking about Greater Washington, really, but the district, for a reason I'll tell you in a moment. And then I'm going to talk about public art and public architecture in the district. So let's go. The New Deal was from 1933 basically to about 42 or 43. But of course, the war really took over in 42, and most of the New Deal agencies were wound down, like the WPA and the PWA, crawled into 1943. So we say it's about a decade, but it's an amazing decade of achievement for the country and for federal policy and for the good of the American people. It was a Franklin Roosevelt administration, first 2 terms and a bit of the 3rd term. And it was led by people like Harold Ickes, Secretary of Interior Frances Perkins, first female cabinet member. See if I can get my brain going here. Harry Hopkins, Mary Bethune, Robert Wagner in Congress, and so on. And of course, famously, Eleanor Roosevelt was the sort of eminence grise throughout. It's a real turning point in American history. It's one of the great turning points that changed our society, changed our form of government, changed the way we think about what government should do for the people and what society should do for the people to help people who are in trouble and to regulate unrestrained capitalism, unrestrained corporate greed. So, briefly, what the New Deal achieved was rapid growth. People don't realize this because the Great Depression was so bad. And I think it's hard for us to imagine living through something like the Great Depression, or was until we lived through COVID in 2020. Because imagine that 2020 had continued for 4 years, and the kind of despair, the unknown, where did this come from? Why is this happening? How could we have suddenly 25% unemployment, economic implosion? And if that had gone on, and at that time, people didn't realize, or government officials didn't realize, that you could pump masses of money the way the feds did during COVID to help stabilize the economy. So the New Deal was the first one to realize that, and they were just flying blind, but they hit on the right solution before it was completely theorized by economics. So it stabilized the economy, led to a rapid recovery, modernization through investment, rising wages, and mass consumption that actually undergirded the whole post-war golden age that everybody attributes to World War II, but actually was in place under the New Deal. Social welfare, with this is the beginning of Social Security, social insurance, mass unionization became legal, mass homeownership began for working people, the creation of the great American middle class, and finally political shifts. The importance of the federal government, the growth of the executive, and of what you might call the administrative state, of mass aid to states and cities. It's really the era of social liberalism, or what they call in Europe, they call social democracy. And the Democratic Party became the dominant party for the next 40 years. Now, I'm not going to go through all these because I got to move along. I want to get to art and architecture. So I'm simply got a list here. I'm going to buzz along, but the array of New Deal's programs and laws is astonishing. We have précis of these on the Living New Deal website, and we're up to close to 100. And people remember maybe 3 or 4: Social Security, the Wagner Labor Relations Act, things like that. Maybe they remember the CCC and the WPA, but it's so much more than that. Public works were at the center of the New Deal. People don't really realize how important the public works programs were. Even professional historians who've written dozens and dozens of books about the New Deal almost always keep public works as a kind of little aside while they focus on politics, on Social Security, on relations with Congress, the Supreme Court, or whatever else it is. And really, as we like to say at the Living New Deal, public works are the heroes of the New Deal, the unsung heroes. And it amounted not just to make work, which is often what people think it was, people leaning on shovels and all that, the way it was accused of by Republicans and conservatives in the 30s, when it was in fact massive investment in public infrastructure, public goods, civic goods, which I will come back to, and you will see in spades in DC. And I have to say 2 things: that all levels of government participated. This was not the federal government imposing itself as is sometimes said by conservative commentators. Oh, you can't have another New Deal or anything like it because, oh, our freedom would be restricted by the federal government. In fact, the federal government worked hand in glove with all the states and all the local governments to create this whole process of social reform, governmental reform, and aid to average Americans. And it turned out they did both very high quality work, even with hand labor. They had a lot of skilled laborers in the WPA, for example, and they did it with almost no corruption, which is kind of amazing. One can't imagine Donald Trump running such a program. What are public works? They're everything. Today, we have this restricted word called infrastructure, which is very boring. Everybody thinks, oh my God, we're talking about sewers and road paving and so on, which they did. They did a lot of it in the New Deal, but it also meant civic buildings, schools, auditoriums, public parks of all kinds, campgrounds, all kinds of fun stuff, conservation. The New Deal was a very big green program at a time when the American land had been absolutely devastated by overcutting of forest fires, and of course the Dust Bowl, famously the Dust Bowl and other kinds. And there was almost no river in America that was swimmable at that time. And the New Deal built many of the sewerage works, as we'll see. And then, of course, they decorated public buildings, public spaces with artworks, which is the part of the New Deal that most people maybe remember fondly. They also did a lot of service projects to employ people. So we tend to think of public works as manly work, people digging ditches, building dams, and so on. But actually, a lot of it was providing school lunches or doing library work, card catalogs in libraries getting reworked, archaeological digs, rebuilding Pueblo Indian ruins down in the Southwest and that sort of thing. I'm not going to go through this. This is for when I do a more in-depth talk, but the number of agencies really was an alphabet soup. It's when we really started using terms like the FTC and the WPA and the PWA and so on. A very important part of the New Deal and its public works is that it was built by average Americans, whether it was skilled laborers, unionized laborers working for the PWA, or it was unemployed workers and the relief work done by the CWA or the WPA or the CCC and FARA and so on. So you had enormous numbers of people, upwards of 25 million people hired during the course of the Depression by the federal government for these relief work and public works projects. It was really amazing. It was young, mostly young men, of course, but a lot of older men, skilled workers, and a lot of women. And notice in the picture below, you'll notice there are people of color. I will come back to this. It included people of color, contrary to some rather erroneous dismissals of the New Deal as having excluded African Americans and others. In fact, here we go. These are all pictures, historical photos from the New Deal in Washington, D.C. These are all African Americans working on parks on the C&O Canal. That was a black CCC company, did all the work on the first 20 miles of the C&O Canal. That's now the park. Skilled work, that's an artist working in restoration at the Recorder of Deeds building, I believe, and a couple of young men being trained by the NYA in carpentry. New Deal public works, we said, well, where are they? Why? How can I see them? Well, they're everywhere. They built in all 3,100 and whatever counties in the United States, every state and territory, because Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico were all territories. every big city and every town of significance, county seats, certainly every county seats and other towns of any significance across the country, every national park, every state park that existed at the time, national monuments, and so on and so forth, everywhere. They redid all the military parks, for those of you who are Gettysburg buffs and so on. They did all those, Revolutionary and Civil War, up and down the East Coast. What's the Living New Deal? That's the New Deal, which is this amazing period of time, which we are trying to get American people to understand better and appreciate, because so many have forgotten. As we know, Americans are not great at history. As Henry Ford, not one of my heroes, so famously said, history is bunk. And we're always looking to the future, but we need to understand our history, because much of it is very usable. Other parts of it are regrettable and need to be remembered so that we can change our ways. But there are things to be in the past to be retrieved, and the New Deal and some of its ideas in its program are exactly fall into that category. So what the Living New Deal is mapping, our basic function is mapping and documenting all New Deal public works, which number in the literally hundreds of thousands, to show that where they are, what was done, because that was never done. There is no archive of New Deal public works. It's in bits and pieces in the National Archives, in local archives, and so on. We educate the public about the New Deal and what it did, and we advocate for New Deal type programs like reviving a CCC to deal with climate change, which unfortunately did not get done thanks to Joe Manchin and his buddies. We feel that we're unearthing a lost civilization. It is amazing. New Deal public works are everywhere across the country. They're right under your feet, as I will show you in DC. You walk through them, you walk over them, and you never see them because most of them are unmarked and they go unrecognized. The comparison I like to make is to the lost Mayan civilizations that are now being recovered. The cities are being uncovered using LIDAR technology. And I've got that nice picture, two pictures, one of, I think that's Chichen Itza, and on the right, I'm not sure, I think it's a different city. But this is shows what LIDAR reveals, that you can't possibly see through the forest. And here it's pretty much the same thing. And we're just unaware of what our ancestors, our grandparents and great-grandparents and great-uncles and aunts did, led by the New Dealers back in the 1930s. We talk endlessly in the United States, for better or worse, about World War II, great moment, the greatest generation. But by the way, a lot of the soldiers who went to World War II, especially at the beginning, were CCC veterans because they were in such good shape. So the New Deal, and the New Deal did a lot of the early war prep work when Roosevelt couldn't openly say, hey, we've got to go to war soon, we better be ready. This is what our national map looks like online on our website. It's this little freckled map of the country, which if you start zooming in, there's Chesapeake Bay, you start to see colored dots. You come in closer to DC and you see, there's a lot of very distinct dots, hundreds of them. We found over 500 sites just in the district alone. And if you get very close, you can see the little icons, which are coded by color and by symbol as public works, as road works, and other, road works and water works, artworks, and so on. So it's very easy to use. And then you click on those icons and up pops a little description of what's there. And if you want to go deeper, you click further and you get the entire page of information that we have accumulated. Sometimes with many, many photos, and lots of information. Other times, what little information we were able to dig up. Our website is a huge archive of materials, of writings, of photographs, tens of thousands of photographs, hundreds of pages of information about everything from Green New Deal policy proclamations to histories, personal histories of some of the leading New Dealers, to personal stories that people have given us about their grandparents or their uncles or their fathers who were in the CCC, and so on and so forth. We get 2 to 4 million visitors per year on the website, which is pretty darn good. And it varies. It goes up and down really with the semester, because our biggest users are clearly teachers and students. So after finals, our usage drops down for the summer vacation or Christmas vacation. We have a new website coming that's going to be launched publicly, and I would say maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks after 2 years of work. And it's going to look very different and be much easier to use for old codgers like me. So if you're put off by scrolling through endless websites, which a lot of people have been with ours, this is going to be much, much easier to use. So I'm very proud of this. A lot of work has gone into this. Public education and outreach, we do talks, we do webinars regularly. We have a newsletter. We do articles, written articles. We do exhibits, public conferences. We did a big one, for example, on women in the New Deal a few years ago, pre-COVID. That's a tour that our founder, Gray Brecken, is leading at the Rincon Annex post office in San Francisco with this unbelievable mural sequence there. We do interviews with the press. We put out social media and so on and so forth. So we're very, very active. I have a staff of roughly 15 people who I pay as well as I can for a nonprofit, but we know how nonprofits work. So try not to press me on that. And we do print maps. We publish print maps of New Deal cities. We've done San Francisco, New York, and DC. And the one of DC, you can find and order on our website. Shay actually has copies if you want to bug her about this. And they're available for $5. They open up into a big poster that's quite elegant on beautiful paper. And it has a map, which you'll see here, of the district, all the New Deal sites, and the big circles are key New Deal sites, which have little pictures there, little icons, thumbnails, and then on the back of the map you get descriptions of the key 35 things, around 35 sites. So it's rich with information. You can use it for a walking tour around the mall when your friends come, when visitors come, or for yourself. It's quite useful, and you can learn quite a bit about DC by studying this, or by just having it with you. It fits nicely in a pocket or a purse. All right, the key lessons that I got when we did this map, we finished it in 2021, 22, launched it at the worst possible time in middle of a pandemic, but I was able to give a lot of talks. Several of us were to organizations like DC Preservation. I hope none of you have had to sit through 2 talks by me, but hopefully you will survive. So key lessons are that the New Deal literally transformed the capital, as it had transformed other big cities and other small towns and counties all over the United States. It is quite amazing, the transformation that was put in place by the investment and the public works of the New Deal. It completed, in the case of DC in particular, there was this plan in place called the Macmillan Plan, drawn up by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and others around the turn of the century of 1900, and promoted by the city fathers and mothers at the time to re-beautify the national capital, to take the old plan from, what the hell's his name? Okay, the old 1787, is it, plan of DC, and to finish it and upgrade it for what then was the 20th century, and at the same time, especially build the federal triangle and the rest of the enormous federal footprint, and to upgrade the basic infrastructure of the city, like the sewage system. It also vastly improved the life of ordinary people through amazing amount of investment in parks, in recreation, schools, health services, public housing, and so on. And of course, art and architecture, which I am getting to halfway through my talk. And of course, it saved a lot of people in the moment from destitution. Okay, what did the New Deal and New Deal Public Works do in DC? Well, it did, first of all, essential infrastructure. So you can start with roads and bridges, and then waterworks, water supply, sewage, and then the waterfront and the river. Three basic parts of modern DC that you probably never think about, although you use them all the time. The bridges over Rock Creek, I think three different ones. The old Calvert Street Bridge, the P Street Bridge, they all have new names now. And so on part of the Parkway, not all of it, the Parkway was in the Macmillan plan. The New Deal finished it with CCC and WPA labor, plus investment PWA monies and DC Commission monies that came directly from Congress. So they did over 200 miles of street improvements, expansion, lengthening, grading, and paving around the whole city. There's the Scott underpass, Scott Square underpass, whatever it's called, in Northwest near DuPont Circle. Some of you may know that. Waterworks, the main thing, they did a bit for the water supply, although most of that predated the New Deal. But what they did that was really earth-shaking and transformed the city was to put in a new trunk sewers, new feeder sewers, especially up the Anacostia River. You can see the map there of it. And then they built the first Blue Plains treatment plant. At the time, there was no sewage treatment. It all went raw into the Potomac and into the Anacostia River, both of which were basically giant sewers. And Blue Plains is now one of the largest sewage treatment plants on Earth, one of the most advanced. And it still has ponds and a laboratory building and pumps. There's a pumping building that go back to the original investments for the New Deal. That pump on the left there is still working. They built things to last back then. And as a result of cleaning up the Potomac, and also that the world was changing from waterways as your main means of moving goods or trains to trucks, the Potomac was completely transformed. This happened to San Francisco Bay out here where I live, which was basically the equivalent of a giant freeway at the time, with every kind of boat you can imagine, ferry boats, barges, coastal boats, and so on. And the Potomac was a working river like that. It was ugly, dirty, and functional. And now it's all been cutesied up, and you go to the waterfront to have a good time, to walk, stroll along Southwest, to go over to Teddy Roosevelt Island, which at that time was a goat farm, I believe, cleaned up by the CCC, and so on. The bridges on the Potomac were not built by the New Deal, which is too bad. I was so disappointed when I discovered that. They're all built just before or after. But they did build a band shell, WPA band shell, and then the federal music project put on performances in that floating band shell where people would sit on the steps in front of the Lincoln Memorial to listen to symphonic concerts, which were very popular, and millions of Americans got to hear their first symphony during the New Deal. I just have to mention National Airport. It's my favorite. Let's see, what's a term I can use that is public, for public consumption. One of my favorite places and favorite ironies, paradoxes of the New Deal, which is that original terminal building and the original, the first tarmacs, the first layout of the airport on Phil and over there in Arlington was pushed through by FDR personally. They had been dithering about where to build a new airport through the 20s. And finally, he just said, you're going to build it here. And it was done. And the terminal building is a beautiful art moderne architecture, example of art moderne. And then it got renamed Ronald Reagan Airport. And Reagan, of course, is the man who tried to dismantle, as president, tried to dismantle the New Deal, even though his father was saved by the New Deal. I don't know if you know sort of about presidential parents, fathers, they're almost always problematic. Clintons, Obamas, Reagans, Jimmy Carter's, they were all often very dicey characters, or they were super strong characters like George Bush's father. And there's a real issue with presidents and fathers and ambition, but we won't go there. I'm not a psychologist, but I am a good historian on the New Deal. So we named it after Ronald Reagan, who actually went from being a New Deal Democrat because of his father to becoming a notable anti-communist and leader of the far right and president of the United States, who introduced neoconservatism as public policy and said, the solution is not government, government is the problem. Exactly the opposite of the New Deal approach. Thank you, Ron. Parks and recreation. The whole Greens ward of Washington, D.C., which one of your most wonderful assets, was put in place with the aid of the New Deal. And the National Mall in particular was gussied up. The Capitol Parks were completely transformed, and they worked on 250 small park and playground projects around the city. National Park Service, one of FDR's first acts was to put the National Park Service in charge of the Capitol Parks, along with national monuments and battlefield parks, and give them much more power and more money to redo, and more aid through the PWA, WPA, CCC to redo the city's parks. So the mall, which was in the, of course, the original L'Enfant plan, and in that's a picture in the lower left of the mall described in the Macmillan plan. And they'd started to put this in place with the Lincoln Memorial and the reflecting pool. So that had been done in the 20s after World War I. But the cleaning up of the rest of the mall, clearing out of old buildings, wartime buildings, a power plant, and other junk was done. And then the great lawn and walkway and lighting and all that you see here looking towards the Washington Monument from the Capitol, all that was done by the New Deal. That black and white or grayscale picture in the lower right is the mall with buildings right across it in the around 1900 or around World War I think, when that was taken. And the whole Victorian idea of the mall was very different from the McMillan plan and the New Deal mall we ended up with. The Capitol Parks, Rock Creek Park was there, but it was in terrible shape and was redone. The National Zoo was massively reworked, improved, expanded, and they put in artworks into it and so on. The Elephant House was put in and other enclosures and so on. And the parkway, the roads were improved, the trails were built and improved. Some of them were there, some of those lovely footbridges, and some of them were built, most of them were built with PWA money. The Anacostia Park was nothing before the New Deal, as far as I know. Very little had been done over there. It was completely reworked. The Botanical Garden was put in. That was a Department of Agriculture, plant division project, and the CCC did the basic work to put it in. The aquatic works for the aquatic park over there, the name of which is now escaping me. Was it Kensington? No. Rats. Should have done my homework before giving this talk. That was all laid down by the CCC. There was CCC camp in Anacostia Park itself. They didn't build everything there. Some things are more modern, like playground facilities. So on the swimming pool was WPA. So people enjoy Anacostia today. And of course, it greatly improved. The east side, that is the black side of Washington, D.C., which is a very segregated city at the time. It has gotten better. We won't give, white America still does a hell of a good job of segregating our cities. We won't go there too much today. But the Langston Golf Course, which was a historic black course, it was a public course, but available to African Americans. They lobbied the sort of African American golf playing elite at the time, lobbied to get that upgraded, and it was by the New Deal, and became quite famous as a park. That's Joe Louis playing golf on the left at the time, and it's still there. It's still a notable, one of the best public courses in the United States. They did all kinds of small parks, too many to enumerate. They also did recreation programs in those parks. There's a couple of them, Folger Park, Marion Park on Capitol Hill are both improved by the WPA. PWA finished Meridian Hill Park with its glorious cascade, which had been planned earlier. It's very much a Beaux-Arts early 20th century park, but it had never been completed. It's still very much in use, and I believe sometimes called Malcolm X Park. Was for a long time anyway. And of course, the buildings and the monuments. The massive federal footprint to accommodate the growth of the federal government in the 20th century had been started under Hoover, but was completed under the New Deal. A whole new raft of civic buildings, DC government buildings, and other public buildings and schools, and monuments, but not so many. The federal office footprint finished the Federal Triangle, but then went all the way around the mall under the New Deal. So you have all kinds of buildings like what's now the State Department, which was Department of War at the time, briefly, Interior Department, the whole West Wing of the White House, where presidents like Reagan and Trump have held forth to dismantle New Deal, was actually completely redone as a New Deal project. The FDR wanted more office space for an enlarged White House staff. The Adams Building, part of an expansion of the Library of Congress, the Social Security and Switzer buildings over south of the mall That's a GSA building there on the lower right. Civic buildings, okay, Howard University. Again, Black Americans were very much served by the New Deal. Not well right at the beginning, but it got better and better as the New Dealers responded to the Black vote, Black civil rights groups, though they weren't called that at the time, agitation from the NCAA and others, and so on. Ickes was a founder of the Chicago NCAA. He put a lot of money into Black school as the head of the PWA. He put a lot of money into African-American schools all over the country, including Howard University, the leading Black college at the time, I guess still is. There were about 5 buildings and all the grounds were redone by the New Deal. That's the library there. Schools, I think that's the Woodrow Wilson High School in DC. That's the DC, that's the Recorder of Deeds building, I believe, in the center, which is very important for African Americans because the Recorder of Deeds was historically, after Reconstruction, a Black man. This DC municipal building, now the cop shop, well, pretty much all the time. An old African American school, the Giddings School, was added to, and I'm going to get, I think that's part of what's now the Howard Hospital, which was added to by or built by the PWA. Boy, if I got those wrong, I'm sure folks from the DC Preservation League will correct me because you know it better than I do. Monuments, honestly, they didn't build much. They completely refurbished the Washington Monument. First big renovation of the monument, which was really in trouble in the 1920s. That's a picture down in the middle of it with scaffolding. PWA paid for that. It was completely remortared and so on, so that it would not fall down. It's been redone a couple more times since then, but the biggest, well, one of the 2 biggest renovations were by the New Deal. The Jefferson Memorial was built, was planned in the 20s, but they couldn't decide what design they wanted. And FDR loved Jefferson and said, "You got to put that on the finish the tidal base and put it there." And he got in big trouble with some of the people who worried about the Japanese cherry blossom trees, cherry trees there. But he forced through the building of it. And of course, it's one of DC's most beautiful monuments. And Roosevelt has a bigger memorial now, but that's much newer. And the only thing he wanted was a block of stone with in memory of him, which is what he got there at the National Archives, which, by the way, the New Deal completely redid. They built the FTC building, they finished the IRS, they finished the Department of Justice, they did the post office building, now the Clinton building, the Interior building, and a host of others. All right, so I finally arrive at arts, and I have not left myself as much time as I should have, for which I apologize. So the important thing about New Deal art is its abundance, that it was for public, for the enjoyment of average people in post offices, public buildings, on the street. And it was meant to delight, educate about history, dramatize the achievements of the American people, and so on. It included murals, sculptures, bas-reliefs, and so on. And then I'll take a moment about its controversies. Okay, art, it's really a unique moment with the federal government putting massive amount of money, although it was only like 3% of the total WPA budget, which itself was only a small part of the New Deal budget. It employed thousands of artists, unemployed artists, musicians, actors, directors, writers, and so on. And it's really unique in the amount of emphasis on public art and the kind of public funding. And, you know, the National Endowment, which people will always point to and say, well, we have a National Endowment now. That was inspired by the New Deal and came into being just after the New Deal during what I like to call the New Deal era, which lasted until the 1970s. A lot of art was done by the people as well, which is important. So murals. American Scene was very popular at the time. One of the reasons a lot of New Deal art is forgotten or was looked down upon by later art historians is because it wasn't abstract, which swept the world after the war. But at that time, American Scene, American history painting were very popular, and they were meant to glorify often what the achievements of ordinary Americans and American workers. The one there, the wealth of the nation, I think is the one on the lower right. We use it on our calling cards for the Living New Deal. You know, science, labor, planning, and so on. It's kind of the whole deal. It's very masculinist in that case, though it has a correlate, a mural. This is from the old Social Security building, now the Cohen building, which features primarily women. Social realism. There was a lot of romanticization of labor at the time, laborism, which went along with New Deal, the revolutionary reforms that New Deal made in labor law and support for labor organizing, which created so much of the post-war middle class, decent wages, decent unemployment, and so on. And but it also featured poverty, social realism. Brooks there in the Ben Franklin Annex post office in the Clinton building. It would show poverty, honestly. But it did also feature working people. Whoops, went the wrong direction on that one. Sorry about that. Well, there we go. A lot of New Deal artists were quite, poop. Don't know why my computer is misfunctioning here. I will plug it in just in case that is an issue. Okay, sorry for that interruption. The artists that were radical both in form and ideas. On the left, there are Groper mural about dam building, which I showed you the first part of in the previous slide. It's in the Department of Interior for the Bureau of Reclamation. But he made the steel for the curve in the dam to look like a hammer and sickle because he was a commie. He was a member of the Communist Party. And some of these artists were, because the communists tended to appeal to alternative intellectuals and artists who were not in the mainstream. The Lowry doors on the Adams building feature all these figures in world history that were keepers of knowledge. And it's quite radical for its time because it doesn't just show Plato and Aristotle. It shows Chinese and Nebuchadnezzar and figures from the ancient Middle East, from Islam and China, from Mesoamerica and so on. I also like that there's nothing quite as radical as the tile sculptures on the inside of the DC municipal building, which ironically became the police department. It was put in the 30s by private donations, not by the New Deal, but I love to show it because it actually has a couple of tiles showing police beating ordinary protesters and citizens. So apropos to our time. And then in terms of sculpture, Ralph Stackpool and the interior building doing something, a sculpture, it's a bas relief. It's not abstract, but it's very sort of cubist in a way that many of the sculptures of bas reliefs like at the time. And then I had to show a picture of Jackson Pollock, whose life and career were saved by the Federal Art Project. He went on, of course, to be the great American abstract revolutionary. Also, a lot of the art and the artists were very diverse in the controller of deeds. Controller of deeds? Okay, got that wrong.
Recorder of deeds.
Recorder of deeds, I'm so sorry. Has magnificent murals that do a lot of African-American history by African-American artists. I don't know the name of the artist, but there's Frederick Douglass Meeting with Lincoln. That building needs to be used and reopened and made a major public art center. Federal buildings, I'll come back to that. We have in the interior building, they brought in a number of Native American artists. That's in the cafeteria by a man named Alchea. And then you have also an interior, the Millard Sheets mural series on African-American progress, which he was white, but they're very, very striking kind of illustrations of African-Americans and as intellectuals, as educators, as artists, and so on. And then I'm going to forget his name, African-American artist that did the mural on the famous Marian Anderson concert, public concert at the Lincoln Memorial that Ickes promoted and Eleanor Roosevelt promoted as to give the thumbs down to the DAR, which wouldn't let Marian Anderson sing in their auditorium in the later 1930s. Sculptures, you have all kinds of sculptures, freestanding, bas reliefs. I love the Lance sculpture, very masculinist, very heroic at the FTC, but absolutely stunning. There's a kind of classic laborist romantic sculpture from the old post office, which is now, back in the days when the post office meant something to the federal government before it became that rump USPS it is today, and is now the Clinton building, which is mostly the EPA. So you have a postal worker carrying a sack there. Then you have a sculpture for children to play on by Lenore Thomas over at the public housing, very famous public housing in Northeast. That's I'm now forgetting. Langston Dwellings. Thank you. Subtitle. The Anteater by Bentweiler, I think is his name, or Kurt Weiler over at the zoo, and a sculpture on the Adams building there. So then you have bas reliefs, which I'm hoping to get. Here we go. Bas reliefs, and a lot of bas reliefs, it's hard to know who did them. They were often done as part of the building itself rather than a federal art project. Some of them were done as federal art project, like the sculptures, the bas reliefs at the Langston Dwellings, done by Daniel Olney. I want to say Feinweiler or whatever his name is. That's at the Elephant House down in the lower left. At the zoo, we have just, I think, an unknown artist, at least unknown to me, bas relief off the government printing office in the center there and so on. And a bas relief from the Social Security building or the railroad building, I can't remember, which is now the Cohen and the Switzer pair there south of the mall. Mosaics don't get enough attention, so I threw these in. The one on the left is a map of DC and the Daley Municipal Building, which was a building of the DC government with funding during the New Deal from Congress, and this magnificent world map that's on the floor of the Ben Franklin Annex in the Clinton building, which was the US Post Office, the department headquarters at the time. That thing is just astonishing. Legacy and controversy. Well, I think the New Deal art needs to be remembered for the amazing amount of art it produced, and also for the number of what we would call minority or people of color doing the murals, doing writing projects for the Federal Writers Project. Very famous, like Ralph Ellison worked for the Federal Writers Project, and so on. The Theater Project, Paul Robeson and others in the Theater Project. It was actually a very important moment for artists of color. Out west, we have Joe Mora and Asian American artists who worked for the Federal Art Project and went on to famous careers. But also the American scene and the dramatization of American art history by white artists sometimes is not so tasty to modernize, and some of it very controversial. I'd like to think that most New Deal art was actually out of the mainstream, but there was a lot of mainstream. And you see a couple on the left here from the old post office building, the Clinton building, which have now been either removed or covered up by Min Chow. This mural in the upper left is by a guy named Min Chow. The one in the bottom center by William Palmer, where they used the post office as an excuse to do classic rah-rah American history with cowboys and Indians. In the upper left, Indians scalping a woman, and it somehow has to do with the dangers of the postal service, which makes no sense at all. And in the lower one, at least, he says he has one about robbers attacking a postal wagon. Okay, could be believable. And then he throws in a random Indians attacking a wagon train, which has, again, nothing to do with the post office. Those two don't sit well today for very good reason. But then there are others you look at, like here's one in the Interior Department in the lower right, and another one in the upper right. One's by a guy named Finney, and the other one by, I can't remember his name. It'll come to me, maybe. And this is one, the upper right is about territories. It was because the Interior Department's in charge of territories. It's the Virgin Islands. It shows Black people working in fields. It actually shows people in very everyday situations. There is what looks like a white overseer there. So, some people today would say, oh, that's terrible. Well, it's not slavery necessarily. It's free Black labor, but not necessarily under great condition. On the other hand, one could say it's an honest portrayal of labor, of Black labor, Black people at work. They are in the foreground, the white guys in the background, and doing what people did. Honestly, taking care of a child. That's actually a healthcare worker taking care of a child in the Virgin Islands at the time. So reasonably honest. One of the miners, placer mining, actually the guy in the foreground is kind of brown. Is he a lot of Mexicans in the gold fields. There were a lot of Chinese in the gold fields. The guy in the back left could be Chinese. How do you take this? Is this, a white glorification of mining, or is it something different? So we can argue about these, and of course it presents a lot of interesting controversies, which we all need to think about. if we're interested in preservation and art, because it matters to people how they're portrayed today. It also matters to other people very much how art is handled and maintained. And we can't fight out all our present day battles through old art. Some of them we have to. Some of them are part of the dominant ruling ideology, like Confederate statues, really will never be missed. And others with New Deal art, you have a real struggle here between this wonderful legacy, much of it which was pretty radical, very radical, public, and in full people of color, against the fact that you get portrayals that are distasteful or misleading or simply smug and naive. There's some very naive stuff. So it's all worth a lot of discussion. And so we have started an art initiative at the Living New Deal to carry that discussion farther, to really develop it, because New Deal art is so neglected by art history and so often involved in these important preservation controversies. Now, if I can get my screen to move. Hello? Wow, that is really annoying. Hello, let's see, there's one more way. Yes. Public architecture, and I will stop in 2 minutes. Okay, folks, sorry about that. I just want to say that architectural styles under the New Deal were everything. They were very eclectic, let 1,000 flowers bloom, or 100 flowers, whichever you like. And they did everything depending on the region, depending on the taste of the architects. And they employed local architects or architects chosen by local governments, state governments all the time. The Treasury was more centralized, but even the Treasury did modernist post offices and Southwestern post office and so on. So just to steam through this, they did neoclassical architecture, especially in the Federal Triangle. And this is just in DC. They did a lot of the sort of federal Georgian revival kind of architecture. That's a post office in Arlington, not actually in DC. Schools, buildings, Howard University. They did modern at the airport, famously Adams Building, Switzer Building now, or the old Social Security Building. I put in, there are these unbelievable, because I love modern architecture. Oh, and also outside the district, up at the National Institutes of Health, there's that wonderful tower that was part of the Naval Hospital. It's in Art Deco or Art Moderne. And there are these schools and civic buildings everywhere in Art Deco that you can spot a mile off. This, in the lower right, it put a school I just discovered in Oakland, California. It's been painted brightly because it's in a Latino district, which loves, Latin Americans love bright colored building. And so they've taken this wonderful modern architecture, painted it up, and it's really just a joy. Okay, let's see if we can move ahead. There we are. Utilitarian international style. I put in, by the way, a picture on the lower right of what's his name? I want to say Hilliard Robinson, the architect of a lot of the alley housing agencies, small scale public housing. Also, he did the Langston dwelling in modernist architecture. He probably did the dormitories at Howard. Then you have, utilitarian pumping house out at Blue Plains, the State Department in the upper middle, the horrible Ford building, which was built for the 1940 census, which, by the way, is very important for Mexican Americans at the time, and the Pentagon, which was actually built under the New Deal. We don't really think of it that way because it's wartime, but it started in 1942. They did regional vernaculars all over the Southwest. Native American style, Pueblo style, Spanish Revival style. This in the lower right is one of my favorites. It's a city hall in Utah where the city fathers had decided they wanted Swiss Revival because it was a dairying area called Midway. So they got a Swiss Revival city hall. I also have to put in a word just to finish about the importance of preservation. The National Registry and the studies of the National Engineering Studies and National Architecture Studies are all started under the New Deal. And enormous work done by New Deal artists to copy folk art and to do things like restore the Frederick Douglass House there in the lower left. Okay, so please visit our website, Living New Deal, get yourself a Washington, D.C. map, recognize the 90th anniversary of the New Deal. Yeah, come help us, come volunteer, submit sites, donate or whatever you wish. And follow us. Just sign up for our newsletter. You can go see us on the PBS newsletter, NewsHour on our website and so on. And I'm sorry I went over, I apologize. I will answer questions now if people have them, which I've unfortunately ignored up to now. So I'm gonna stop. Did I stop sharing?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much. That was great. I'll ask you a few questions. And for anyone that might need to head out, this will be recorded so you can access it on DCPL's YouTube channel at a later date if you need to pop out. Our first question is, how did they decide where to allocate money for the New Deal? Who pushed hardest for funding DC-based projects?
Well, I wish I knew more about DC-based projects in particular. That is a shadowy history that in the time we were doing our map and I really got into DC as an outsider, I couldn't really unearth that. A lot of it went through the DC Commission at that time. It's from, in the mysterious ways that Congress has always treated DC, which was even probably worse then, or better briefly when the New Deal pumped money into it. In general, they had formula, PWA, WPA, they had formula for how they allocated their money. There is an economist who's on our board of advisors, Price Fishback at the University of Arizona, who with a number of other economists have done studies over the years of trying to figure out what the formula were. They tended to favor poorer areas, of course, at the time. And to some extent, they favored the West, the far West, because it was felt to be underdeveloped at the time, which is ironic given California and Silicon Valley and everything else that California has done post-war. But at the time, people in the East thought California was a poor place, which it wasn't. But a lot of the rest of the West was relatively poor and at that time, very pro-New Deal. Utah, states like Utah and Montana had senators and governors who were big followers and friends of FDR. The South tended, oddly, ironically, because it was very poor and very Black, probably got less than its fair share. And that had to do with the politics of the South. And but it started to get more and more towards the end when they focused on Southern economic development as a big drain or as an anchor on US development in general.
Another question that we have is, we know that the DC Recorder of Deeds building is on DCPL's most endangered list because it's been neglected. Are there how many New Deal murals or works of art would you say are endangered or at risk for, being taken down or fading? Is there any way that we can help with that, or could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think the biggest problem in DC Well, the two bigs are probably DC government is perennially underfunded, and some of these buildings that fall, and the school district, um, there is this problem, persistent problem all over the country of neglect, particularly when you get down to the municipal level with after 40 years of neoliberalism and budget cuts at state level as well as national level. There are a lot of schools and other basic municipal government functions. You have a lot of neglect. You get privatization. The post office did a massive sell-off because of Congress, conservative Congress in the early 2000s, forcing them to pay directly for all their pensions, which was absurd, just a way of punishing the USPS and its unionized workers. That's now been rescinded, thank heaven. But for years, they were selling off beautiful post office, public buildings with public art, simply to pay off their pension plan, which is insane. And the other problem, of course, is the federal government. With our paranoid style of 21st century government in the wake of 9/11 and other incidents, federal buildings are harder and harder to get into. The Justice Department in particular is a sore point because it has magnificent murals, which I didn't use much in my illustrations because I never got into photographing. We have some very good photographs by one of our people that was done before it was so locked up. So that building needs to be reopened, at least more tours. Interior, by contrast, is very public. They run wonderful tours. They welcome the public, so please go there. EPA is very stingy, and that needs to be opened up more. Maybe it's better, a little better now under the Biden administration. I don't know personally. So I think all those federal buildings, other than interior, need a lot of work. I guess the old Social Security building, the Cohen building is pretty accessible. I got a nice tour there. That may have changed for a while under Trump. I just don't know. But I think it's something you all at the Preservation Agency keep your eye on. So many of these things need to be open and available to regular, easily accessible tours.
We have a few questions about the website for the Living New Deal as well. So we have one person who has asked how long it takes to confirm a newly submitted site. How long would it take for it to be posted online?
I think it's usually about a couple of weeks. It depends if it's not very adequate, if you haven't submitted adequate documentation, it takes longer. And sometimes it goes into a kind of draft list, which is, I'm afraid to say, way too long. I have some hundreds of sites that were very hard to ever follow up the documentation. And somebody says, well, I think this is New Deal. And we've done that in the past, and our enthusiasm say, oh, this has to be a New Deal. But then there wasn't adequate documentation, and we don't put up a site if we don't have that. So please, if you do submit a site, be sure you've done your homework on it, or there's a plaque that you photographed or whatever it is that led you to think that was a New Deal site. We try to get it as fast as possible, but I have one, our research manager does this, and then we have another on and off staff member who works hard on this. I have another RA working in Los Angeles now because we're trying to make progress there. And I'd love to have another one, and maybe next year I will be able to afford one. So if anybody wants to fund an RA for a year, we could get a lot of those little problems solved.
We have one other question as well about the database of books and other resources. If somebody wants to submit, a memoir, a book, a resource, how would they go about doing that?
Well, if you have a memoir, personal memoir, we have a New Deal story section. There's actually a form if you want to bother to fill it out. You can always send everything directly to our info@livingnewdeal.org, which is our general email, very readily found on the website. Website is livingnewdeal.org, all one word, livingnewdeal.org, and easy to find. If you Google Living New Deal, bingo, we come right up. We're pretty high on Google searches, though we don't place an ad. And now, as you know, the first page of Google searches is all ads. Regrettably, it used to be better. Anyway, so that you can send it to us through that means. If you have a suggestion, like a book that we've left off of our bibliography, so you think is really important, we have longer bibliographies and then short bibliographies for students and teachers by topic on the New Deal, by about a dozen topics. But if you think there's something missing that should be in there, for heaven's sake, send us your opinion on info@Living New Deal.
Yes, and there we'll be able to, DCPL will send a final email to all registrants with the links to the New Deal website and some of their resources, the map, things like that. I think those are pretty much all of our questions. I guess, Richard, the final thing that I'll ask you, that you've already mostly answered, but well, actually you didn't answer it. What is your favorite New Deal project, public work in DC?
Oh, wow. Well, I've got to say the Jefferson Memorial. It's just fantastic. I mean, I know Jefferson, we can fight over the legacy of Jefferson endlessly. And for some people, Beaux-Arts is not their favorite, but what a glorious example. Oh yeah, it's neoclassical and derivative in some ways, but it's really beautiful. So I'm going to go with that.
It's a good one.
I lack another. The only other one that might compete would be the terminal over at National Airport, because I love the modern stuff. There are some schools around the country that in modern that are just knockouts. There's the Timberline Lodge on Mount Hood that is just blow your mind, or the Red Rock Amphitheater in Colorado. There are some New Deal public works, and of course, how about Hoover Dam, Boulder Dam, as it should be called, one of the greatest wonders of the world.
Well, Richard, this has been great. I will thank you for giving the talk, and we can end it here. Anything else that you'd like to say to wrap up?
No, I'll get the Washington D.C. map if you're interested. It's really great, and it makes a great poster on the wall. It's you can actually get a poster version from us if you're really dying for a poster. I think we've got a few left, but we definitely have a lot of maps. And Shay would be happy to hand you one if you come down to DC Preservation League. So keep one on your desk, Shay. So thank you, Shay, for inviting me. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, DC Preservation League, for your work. And everybody, come visit us at thelivingnewdeal.org.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Richard. Thank you, everyone. And I hope everybody has a great day.